More chaos at the FIA under Mohammed Ben Sulayem that seems to be having a tangible negative impact on F1, as we saw with an incredibly messy Qatar Grand Prix. So many strands to what's going on in the FIA at the moment, but let's start with that chaotic race. Only the second one to be overseen by the new race director, Rui Marquez. Scott, it seemed like a risky decision at the time to effectively fire your most experienced race director and replace him with only 3 races of the season left to run. So has that decision been exposed by what we saw in Qatar?
Yes, I think it has. The first impression that Rui Marquez made in Las Vegas was positive. The drivers were quite enthusiastic about how much he'd listened to them, how quickly there had been some changes implemented based on driver feedback in the drivers briefing. And then you went into the Qatar weekend, obviously the second part of a triple header, and there was a big meeting between the drivers and the FIA on the Thursday. Marquez was part of that as race control, and the stewards being present. That was a big annual review. It wasn't some crisis urgent talk or anything like that. And again, loads of positivity came out of that in terms of drivers and the FIA officials sort of being on the same wavelength, being aligned on some key issues. But the problem was never going to be kind of the kind of broader principle of how do we want things to work. It was going to be how it actually works, because Niels Vicic, Marquez's predecessor, had made that role his own in the wake of Michael Masi's exit after the 2021 Abu Dhabi finale and everything that went in there. Vicic actually has been Mohammed Ben Sulayem's only race director. And Ben Sulayem, remember, wanted to have multiple race directors. He wanted to rotate the job because he thought that the job was that hard. Now he's booted out Vicic, there's someone else in. That has come alongside a justification that apparently the job's not that hard after all. So it doesn't actually matter if you have less experience. There's loads of people in race control, loads of people back at Geneva at one of the FIA's facilities to assist. And I think...
And AI too.
Yes, and we've got a case study now in Qatar of that shows the job is complicated. Little things can trip you up. There was a misjudgment that was made. They have attempted to justify it after the fact. I don't think it's a particularly good justification. There's a strand of rationale in that they were a little bit worried about deploying a full safety car and influencing the race too much, and a virtual safety car wasn't enough because it wouldn't have given the marshals enough time to get on track to clear the debris. So you ended up in this awkward halfway house where I think a more experienced F1 race director would have just played it safe and thrown a safety car. That in itself is not a problem, but the FIA's kind of behaviour around it all, that's the problem, because it's needlessly defensive.
We have to remember as well, there's also the problem of the race director role almost getting politicised and commercialised, because that factor of how you influence the race shouldn't impact a safety call. To have a safety car, that seemed an obvious thing to do to allow the mirror to be cleared to avoid somebody hitting it and spreading debris everywhere, which is exactly what happened. And remember, this was the key lesson of Abu Dhabi 2021, that massive controversy. The reason that happened was nothing to do with favouring one driver or another. It was entirely due to the obsession about finishing under a green flag condition. So the race director had to think about other factors beyond just the good management of the race. So this is a really, really messy thing. It's a big problem to have this becoming such a big storyline. We can't just keep sacking and replacing race directors. A, there's not many of them, and B, that's just not the way to do things. So this all needs to be really got under control, because I think there are priorities that need to be focused on about just the good, safe, sensible running of the race, which normally takes precedence, but it's becoming confused by all this. I don't envy anyone who's got that race director role because of these considerations that in other series they wouldn't have to worry about quite so much. I'm all for making sure the racing is as fair and runs as well as possible, but there has to be a line where it's just all about good administration of the race, and I personally don't think that was what happened with that call in Qatar.
This whole FIA thing, I mean, it's endlessly chaotic, and I wonder if we'll still be talking about this when we come to do our live shows in January, Scott. It seems like at this rate, we inevitably will be. How many more people are going to be fired before we even get to that point?
Yeah, we're going on tour, so to speak, in January, back-to-back shows in London and Birmingham on the 16th and 17th. And I'm a little bit concerned. It depends. I trust the way that we do things a little bit more. I hope that we don't end up with the same kind of turnover that means I'm expecting to do the live shows and I plan to do the live shows and I have a lot of fun looking forward to the live shows, only to be ruthlessly replaced at short notice without anybody being informed. And my suspicion is that when we're looking ahead to F1 2025 and all that lies in store, how is the FIA not going to be a talking point? I think we should. I mean, Ed, I don't know how you feel about this. We should probably try to keep it to a minimum. Otherwise, because those events are super fun, great opportunity to be in the room and chat between each other, but also obviously with the audience. And maybe we don't want to get bogged down too much in FIA politics.
Well, I think even if we don't talk about the FIA side of things, there's going to be a big audience Q&A section, isn't there? And it's definitely going to come up. I have no doubt about that. The Race F1 podcast always welcomes questions from listeners, or in this case, those who attend the live show. We should add, actually, that this is an exclusive show for those in the room. It's not going to be released separately, so it's the only way to hear what we're talking about there. Very much looking forward to it. Scott, you're going to be there. We're going to have Mark Hughes there. We're even letting you, Ben, into the live show to turn up, provided you're on best behaviour. Maybe I might reserve the right to FIA replace you at the last minute, but what are you going to bring?
Well, that is your right as the effective Mohammed Ben Sulayem in this scenario. I'm really excited about this. You guys did a live show, didn't you, for the race a couple of years ago, so you must be excited to go back on tour. For me, it'll be the first time on tour. Obviously, we love talking about F1. That's what we're doing now. If you want to come and see us talk endlessly about F1 over these 2 dates, as Scott mentioned, on the 16th and 17th of January, look for the link in the description. Look for the link in the pinned comment to buy tickets. £25 for a ticket. Perfect present for family or friends at Christmas, or for yourself if you fancy coming and seeing us talk about F1 live rather than on YouTube. But anyway, enough about us. Turning back to Mohammed Ben Sulayem, he doesn't really like explaining himself to F1, to the paddock. He likes to do his interviews in the media, basically, and he's been at it again, hasn't he, Scott? Giving a quite explosive and blunt interview, I think, to Autosport, where he's effectively said, I don't have to account for my decisions and it's none of anyone's business. So how's that gone down in the F1 paddock?
Yeah, I think he's done a couple of choice interviews because that's the way that he likes to do things, and I don't have a problem with that because it's ultimately completely down to him, who he speaks to and how he speaks to them. The message gets out, and that's what matters. I can sit here now and say that the contents of those interviews are slightly concerning is an understatement, and it doesn't matter who he said that to for me to form that conclusion. It's very clear that Ben Sulayem doesn't believe he answers to anyone except the people who vote for him, which you could argue is kind of the mandate of any politician, really, is they're responsible for the people who have put them in power. But I think it's a little bit more than that. It feels like one step more aggressive in terms of the belligerence almost, and just refusal to accept a voice from anyone else except for those within the FIA who are on his side. I mean, first of all, that creates an echo chamber, which means he's only hearing what he wants, and that is one of the concerns within the F1 paddock. You see the amount of turnover within the FIA. The fear is that that's because Ben Sulayem is basically weeding out people who push back on him, who don't agree with the way he does things, not necessarily the policies, but the execution of them, or whatever it may be. And they're being replaced effectively by much more kind of compliant individuals, and you see that we see that on quite a regular basis. Actually, there are a lot of very good people at the FIA, hard workers, knowledgeable people, experienced people who want to do a better job, want the FIA to be as good as it can be, want to make a positive impact on Formula One. I think that those people are being undermined by the actions of the president, the turnover that we've seen in the staff, the changes on the race control front and around the F1 side of things. And it's just that it's a mismanagement that's totally unnecessary. But if you listen to Ben Sulayem speak and you read his quotes, we're completely wide of the mark. There's no chaos at all. Everything's fine. We should all shut up. He knows better than everybody.
There was an amusing comment he made as well, where he said, when asked about drivers being irritated about the race director not being communicated properly, the change of race director, and he said, well, teams don't have to inform the FIA when they change things. Actually, they sort of do, because there's a thing called the competitor staff registration system, which is senior decision makers in the team, sporting director, team principal, race engineers as well, have to sign up and register effectively. And that was created quite rightly in case there was a situation like Singapore 2008 again, where they wanted to take action against individuals for rather extreme violations of rules and might want to try and ban them. So there kind of is a little bit of that. But I must admit, I don't really like some of the approach of this, the lack of transparency and lack of accountability, for the simple reason that the FIA needs strong leadership. Mohammed Ben Sulayem himself has said F1 needs a strong regulator. Absolutely right, and he's fighting for the FIA. However, the refusal to be transparent and clear and accountable on these things, to me, is the very opposite of strong leadership. To me, it's insecure leadership. Strong leadership collaborates, it communicates, it takes dissenting views, it takes all that on board, and it comes out with the best collaborative decision. But the man at the top can make that final decision based on that. So I'm a little bit concerned about that particular approach and what's coming through in those interviews that Scott referenced.
Yeah, I would agree that just on the point of transparency, I think there is a feeling that occasionally speaking on his terms is transparent. Speaking vaguely about specific areas that he wants to talk about counts as transparency. You know, we use Qatar as a case study, what happened there. And obviously this isn't Ben Sulayem directly, but it is a result of his leadership, because it always filters from the top down. You know, on Sunday night we were promised that there would be an explanation of the key incidents in the race, because there'd been a lot of questions about them. Time trickled by. I think it was sort of between 10 and it must have been closer to 11 p.m. when we got that first notification. Then it was closer to 1 a.m. that we were told, actually, this isn't going to happen. It's going to come on Monday. Bit frustrating, but you think, all right, but it's going to be worth it when you get a proper explanation of things. And then, to quote what was sent, in the interest of transparency, they send an explanation that amounts to about 200 words and a few bullet points that aren't even fully elaborated on. And I've had subsequent conversations with people in the FIA since then. I've managed to flesh them out a little bit, but if I've been able to flesh that out afterwards, why wasn't that included in this initial explanation that's been done in the interest of transparency? I think not to use the word too much, but transparency and accountability are buzzwords to this organisation, and they have a very different idea of what they mean versus what they actually mean in reality.
Yeah, it keeps coming back to that buzzword. Not to mention it again too many times, but transparency. Ben Sulayem talks all the time about being transparent and then really just wants transparency on his own terms. And he seems to be deaf to the feedback too. You know, we convened to talk about that GPDA letter, that explosive letter, basically calling out his leadership style and particularly his style of communication. And we feared when we had that discussion that he would basically double down rather than, you know, have a sympathetic ear to what the drivers were saying. And it seems like, well, that's exactly what's happened in his response publicly in Qatar. He's effectively told the drivers to shut up and get on with their jobs, hasn't he? That must have gone down really badly, Ed. Yeah,
well, he's just said, no, I'm not going to deal with you on this and communicate with you properly, and we're not going to work together on this, which I don't think is a great approach at all. The GPDA was fairly careful on this because they took a little bit of time before formulating their response and then publishing it. So I think they wanted to try and avoid endless sniping and comment. But I think they'll be quite disappointed with just being dismissed out of hand. And I do wonder if this is also connected to the question of transparency in terms of fines, because George Russell, GPDA director, he's the de facto spokesman of the GPDA, isn't he? He's the guy who gets asked to talk on the GPDA's behalf. He's mentioned several times during media sessions, media interviews, that he wants more transparency on where driver fines go. And Mohammed Ben Sulayem has addressed that in slightly strange, chippy terminology, because he's quite rightly said, oh, we've spent this vast amount of money on grassroots. It's 10.3 million, something like that. I forget the exact number. And also they spend a lot on safety initiatives, all sorts of things. And the FIA does do that good work. So what I don't really understand is why the answer to that is, oh, actually, that's a good idea. We can tell you about all of this good work in great detail. Why not? Because they do it. So it just seems self-defeating to do that. And remember, Ben Sulayem himself, quite justifiably, was critical about the lack of transparency in the FIA financially when he came in. He said there was this massive financial black hole that he had to tackle that nobody had been told about. Well, this is, again, financial transparency, so it's something surely he should want. So this one really, really puzzles me, because it should be very, very easy to say, oh, actually, these driver fines, and of course drivers don't like paying fines and they'll want to try and cast aspersions over it, so defeat them with evidence. Show them what you're doing, tell them what you're doing, then they can't argue with it. No one can, because it will be good FIA work. And just this reaction suggests there's something being hidden. Again, transparency puzzles me.
It seems like basically they're in a tailspin, doesn't it? People are fleeing. He keeps talking about how, they're replacing people, hiring more people than they're firing. But that brain drain of experience that we've talked about, all the chaos that just seems to follow him around and then seep into F1. How do they move forward from this? Because he just doesn't seem interested in kind of being conciliatory at all.
Well, it's going to continue, isn't it? It's not going to change, because you have to remember that the FIA is not controlled by Formula One, and in fact the sporting side of the FIA is a minority of its activities. It's a mobility club and a sporting administration club, and it's about 2/3, 1/3 is, I think, the rough split. So Ben Sulayem himself, his position depends on getting the votes from FIA members, and as far as I understand it, he's going to stand for another term, and it doesn't seem like there's much opposition. So he's there to stay, almost certainly. The question is whether the FIA is there to stay. There have been murmurings in the past about whether F1 could find an alternative regulator. Not the path of least resistance, I would say, but this isn't going to help that kind of feeling that maybe they need to do that. And it's a real shame, because F1 is basically made up of the regulator, the FIA, the commercial rights holder, which is Liberty Media, F1 as we refer to it, and the teams, plus the promoters, I guess, the people who put on the races, and they need to work together. So I want to see collaboration, because I don't know about you, Scott, but I think the idea of F1 having to go with another regulator is really concerning, just from a practical point of view, and actually the history of the FIA, because for all the criticism, it has played a big part in the evolution of motorsport and the administration of motorsport over the decades.
Yeah, it is something that has become less of a talking point within F1 over the last 18 months or so. I think relations between F1 and the FIA, Stefano Domenicali and Mohammed Ben Sulayem, are better than they have been. But I do feel like Domenicali's patience is being tested, because they're trying to kind of stay in their respective lanes. Ben Sulayem, for all of the criticism, he has stayed away from the commercial matters. He's not really sort of strayed into FOM's area there, and F1 in return is trying to not, light any fires under the FIA, because the FIA is doing that by itself, frankly, with what Ben Sulayem's up to. So you end up in a situation where they're kind of, I think F1's watching quite cautiously. There are a lot of stakeholders who are aware of Ben Sulayem's kind of power and influence ultimately as the FIA president, but also the direct potential to meddle with things like race control and other senior appointments within Formula One. And, he just a good example of this is just the fact that in a different interview Ben Sulayem's done, he's kind of distanced himself from the turnover and said, well, that he hasn't fired these people. And the implication is that, he puts in place a strong FIA that under different department heads are then empowered to run things as they see fit and make replacements as they see fit. But I think that is basically, one person loads the gun and aims it, but just gets someone else to pull the trigger. I think it's a little bit more like that, frankly. So I'll be honest, I think the season couldn't be ending at a better time. I think for F1 and the FIA's benefit, the races need to stop happening. It needs to get out of the news cycle and be hopefully a little bit more stability. But I think if there is any more turnover over the winter, or there are any sort of further signs of problems and dissatisfaction, I think this will be a big talking point at the start of 2025.